So our summer teaching series is on cultural idols that surround us. And the topic for this week is the idol of self-expression. And if I ever doubted that God provides, as I was musing about an anecdote to start this sermon, I read in the New York Times an article about the rise in performative males. This was a new one for me. It's amazing, actually. A performative male is a man who styles himself to look like what a man thinks feminist women like. So it's sort of like mansplaining progressive desire, I guess. I don't know. It's a style intended to make men likable to progressive women through specific aesthetic choices, including, I marveled, tote bags, books written by women, matcha drinks, and Labubu dolls. And I didn't know what that last one is either, and I got a big eye roll from my eldest about that one. In other words, this is a certain form of self-expression emerging from our particular North American cultural moment, and it is one that, as the article makes abundantly clear, is easily mocked. But the fundamental premise of the article is not the silliness of the performative male form of self-expression. That's not the main point. Well, that is the main point, but that's not the premise. The premise of the article, the thing the whole thing's founded on, is that contemporary life essentially is an exercise in self-expression, especially in a place like Toronto. Your life is a performance of the self in many ways. And the younger and more online you are, the truer this probably is for you. Anyone who's on social media or online dating platforms knows this. The article quotes Tony Wang, the founder of consulting and trends forecasting company Office of Applied Strategy, and I was like, I wonder what they're like and what they do. Like, the picture was so cool, like, of their team was so cool that if I put it up, it would have broken the projector. That's how hip they were. Like, the guy's wearing like a net shirt in his like team picture. It was just next level cool. Anyway, so Tony Wang, who helps companies make money based on forecasting trends, says that on social media, everything to a large degree is a performance. But regardless of your age or digital identity, if you're in this room or if you're catching the sermon later online, I suggest to you that to one degree or another, you almost invariably share the terrible existential burden that is common to virtually everyone in 21st century North America, which is the inescapable task of deciding who you are and what your place in the world is, and then expressing that self to other people. To quote Wang, quoting RuPaul, "We're born naked, and the rest is drag." This is very much the ethos of our culture. Who are you? You've got to figure it out. Now, what do I mean by this? Let me unpack it a little bit. In previous times, and indeed in other places around the world today, in what we might describe as more traditional societies, people don't necessarily have to figure out who they are, because that question is answered for them in large measure before they're ever born. Who am I? Well, I'm the child of my parents and of their parents before me. I belong to this family, this tribe, this people. I am related to this land. If I am a man or a woman, I am what my culture says that means, and I have to act accordingly. My place in the universe has been established by my culture's religious outlook. In a traditional society, who I am is not a problem to solve, but something established that I then need to live into. And that's just not true in North America today. In modern Western culture, the self is an open-ended question because our culture has, over many years, weakened or severed entirely the relationship between an individual and the traditional sources of identity that would have supplied the self. So for better or worse, the promise of our society is that none of those traditional markers has to matter for your future if you don't want it to. Wherever you come from, you can be whoever you want to be. Now, that is not actually true. As women, sexual minorities, racialized people can well attest to, you discover pretty fast that, in fact, where you're coming from and who you are is going to matter a lot to some people. But it is at least the promise that we see in commercials, that you are free to be whoever you want. Canada is a multicultural country, a country of immigrants. You may have the lived experience of being born in a society where who you were was a given, and then you came to Canada where it's an open question. Maybe that was jarring for you. Or you may be the child of immigrants and had to deal with the differences between your parents' expectations around identity and the sensibilities that you developed growing up here. And when I describe these, it's a bit of binary thinking, but when I describe this, maybe you're responding like, one of these sounds amazing. Like, oh my gosh, I wish I had the security of that traditional society. That sounds so amazing. Or like, oh my gosh, I really long for the liberation, the freedom, the open-ended freedom of this society, right? I'm not saying this to pick one over the other. Each comes with its own blessing and curse. I just want to sort of paint a picture of them. A traditional society offers a security of self, but it can be oppressive and smothering, especially to people who don't fit in. And our society is liberating for many people, by contrast, but it comes with an unavoidable anxiety. It's the anxiety of having to figure out who you are, what your place in the world is, where the self becomes a question, not a given, where you have to construct it, because nobody's giving it to you. Nobody's giving it to you. You can kind of be and do whatever you want, right? So the self becomes an ongoing performance that we do in front of other people. And in some ways, in the most extreme senses, I think the self is a performance in the modern West, where we just sort of go through life performing. And I think we go through our lives in the modern West with something like constant stage fright as a result. And in a consumer capitalist economy marked by persistent digital surveillance and algorithmic marketing, the stuff we buy no longer answers the question, what is it you want or what is it you need? It answers the question, who do you want to be? Now, let me put myself out there as Exhibit A. There is a wicked irony in a sermon about the evils of self-expression coming from a guy with 2 armfuls of tattoos and 1 outfit. Aren't I a walking exercise in self-expression? Like, to a certain extent, guilty as charged. Granted, when I started wearing this and got tattoos, I didn't know I was going to be preaching on this at some point, but anyway, for me, the consistency of outfit is less about the communication of a certain identity than it is, I don't want to think every day about what my clothes might communicate, and I sweat a lot, right? How's that for self-expression? But even that opting out is a choice. I could be standing in front of you in a suit and tie, I could be standing in front of you in a priest collar, and both of those would be expressing very different selves in this context. On some level, each of you expressed yourself when you got dressed today, because your clothes aren't just functional. They communicate who you are in the world. I bet that there are things you would not wear because of what it would say about who you are, right? I took my daughters back to school shopping just yesterday. It's amazing to watch them developing their own senses of style, which I love, but also just kind of their awareness of the language of what clothing and style communicates. They're doing exactly what the culture demands that they do, which is to form and express a self. But it shows how the burden of expressing the self is just intrinsic to our culture, and it's inescapable. You can't opt out. Even when you see movements that are ostensibly rejections of our current cultural moment, which often aspire to an imagined bygone era that was untroubled by our particular contemporary anxieties, these are always just parodies of real traditional identity. The important element is the priority of choice, because if you choose tradition, it's not tradition anymore. It's just like vintage. The extremely online trad wife, Instagramming her cheese-making experience on her homestead, is not actually returning to any kind of traditional reality. She's just another instance of consumer self-expression, nostalgically LARPing an imagined reality that never actually existed in the first place. And if you didn't understand most of those words, like, good for you. There is a religious version of this too. I recently read about the resurgence in the popularity of cross jewelry, so like wearing a cross as jewelry. And the article quoted various online personalities, primarily young women, who appreciated public figures wearing a cross because of the religious signaling that it offered. Now, in our scripture reading today, we heard Jesus say, if anyone would be my disciple, they must pick up their cross and follow me. Obviously, we'd all agree, putting on a necklace doesn't constitute picking up the cross. Don't mishear me. If you're wearing a cross right now, I'm not criticizing you. There's nothing wrong with wearing a cross as a sign of your faith. But being a Christian, we can all agree on this, right? Being a Christian is not principally a matter of self-expression. Being a Christian is not principally a matter of self-expression. A Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus means a way to be lived. It's not an identity to be adopted and communicated. And that, I think, causes so much of the confusion around what it means to follow Jesus in our age, because we traffic in identity. We all get identity and self-expression really well. If you're in Toronto and you're, earning a living, you have to be fluent in this kind of self-expression. You just have to be. It's another language alongside of English. So we traffic in identity, but if Christianity is not an identity, here's this meaningful thing, and we want to treat it as such, there's a category confusion. If we're going to see true Christianity, following Jesus, is in many ways the antithesis of self-expression. So what does that mean for people in a culture where self-expression is the inescapable task of existence? If we can't opt out of self-expression, and self-expression can never yield true faith, what do we do? I'm going to save the punchline, but that's the question I want in our heads as we go into the scripture today. Okay? So, to recap, in the gospel story that Antoinette read for us today, Jesus has begun teaching his followers about how he's going to die, and they are understandably horrified. And Peter says, "This can't happen to you," and Jesus rebukes him and uses it as a teaching moment. "If anyone wants to become my follower, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Let me unpack this episode. Up to this point, Jesus has been traveling, working miracles, teaching. He's attracted all these disciples around him. And at a certain point, he asks his core group, like, who do people say that I am? Like, what's the word on the street? So they give him some answers. And then he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter, his top student, answers, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, for God my Father has given this knowledge to you." In other words, you didn't pick this up from the vibes that I've been giving. My identity doesn't come from self-expression, it's coming from divine revelation. And then Jesus tells them, don't tell anyone yet, because it's not ready for public consumption, which makes what comes next extra shocking. Having just been revealed as the Messiah, Jesus talks about dying an unjust death. And Peter, I like to think of him as sort of flying high off of the success of his last intervention, where he's like, yeah, I'm going to shoot from the hip again. He's like, God forbid, this can never happen. And Jesus turns on him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's the worst. Can you imagine Jesus saying that to you? "Get behind me, Satan. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Not on divine things, but on human things. The devil wants Jesus to accept being God's son without doing God's will, which is dying on the cross. Peter's thinking from a human mindset. The Messiah ought to triumph. But the divine plan is that Jesus dies and is resurrected to open up eternal life for us. So Jesus turns this moment into a teaching opportunity. "If anyone wants to become my follower, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Imagine how shocking this would have sounded before the resurrection. This is like basically being invited to a suicide cult. I mean, for real. Because when someone was crucified, they carried their crossbeam to the place of their execution when they were nailed on it and then lifted up. And nobody ever came down alive. If you take up the cross, that means you have no earthly future in front of you. You have no more hopes, you have no dreams, you have no aspirations. There's nothing you can do, nothing you can anticipate except the road to the pole and then being crucified. So Jesus is saying, in effect, if anyone wants to become my follower, treat yourself as a condemned person. Your old life is over. Now come follow me. Jesus continues, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Divine things, human things. Wanting to save your life is a very human thing. It's completely understandable. That's all our natural impulse. But Jesus says, don't set your mind on human things, set your mind on divine things. If you adopt this interior posture of carrying the cross, you're losing your life, but Jesus is saying, follow me and you will find real life. But if you try and save your life, setting your mind on human things, which runs from the cross, you're going to lose it. Why? Because you can't run from death forever. And the death you finally die won't lead to the life that I'm going to lead you to. He continues, what kind of deal is that? What does it profit you if you gain the whole world? If you spend your whole life not following me, but if you spend your whole life trying to get all the things of this world, what does it matter with you if you gain the whole world but then forfeit your life? If I were to hand you right now the title deed to every property on the earth, instantly making you the wealthiest person on the planet, and you died 10 seconds later, what good would that be to you? What good would it be to you dropping dead as the proud owner of the entire earth? And when death comes knocking, who has enough money to pay death off? Send it away. In other words, setting your mind on human things is fundamentally myopic because it's kind of making do while you're here, knowing that someday you're going to die and all the stuff you spent so much energy on in this life will become completely meaningless. But Jesus is saying, I'm here to show you the divine plan. It's a death that leads to life. And if you'll give the life that you have as an offering to God and follow in my footsteps, you will join me. And when I return in glory, I will vindicate you. But accepting that requires faith because it's worse than counterintuitive. It's a completely nonsensical way to live unless Jesus is exactly who he said he was. Unless his death takes away our sin and grants us forgiveness and restores our relationship with God. Unless he was truly resurrected and lives now eternally and he is alive right now and invites us into that same life. Okay. So what does this mean for us as we contemplate the idol of self-expression? I want to suggest two implications for our lives before I wrap up. First, I think one of the implications of bearing a cross and following Jesus is that we cannot enthusiastically participate in a culture of self-expression. I'm not saying you can opt out, you clearly can't, but there are levels. You can be like, okay, or you can lean in. And what I'm saying is I don't think we can enthusiastically participate because it involves setting our minds habitually on human things, to be preoccupied with the task of presenting ourselves and reinventing ourselves and from other people. I think this should make us pretty cautious about chasing fashions and trends in general, because what's truly to be gained by that? One of the things we're talking about in this series is idols always require a sacrifice. What's one of the sacrifices of fast fashion is the catastrophic ecological impact of chasing image in this way, right? It should also make us deeply ambivalent, if not hostile, to mediated digital realities that are entirely self-expressive. If you want to interpret this passage as saying you should get off social media entirely, I think you would be on very solid ground. Very solid ground. Because if you are preoccupied with our cultural forms of self-expression, either in terms of mental attention or the time that you dedicate to it, then you are going to be preoccupied with yourself in a way that no one can. It's not that you can't be, because actually all this is a spectrum. It's not, there's either or, there's hyperbolic language in Jesus' speaking, but we're all on a journey. So to the extent in which you are preoccupied with self, it is the extent to which you are trying to shoulder that cross off your back. These things are at tension with each other. And if you're preoccupied with this sense of self, of displaying yourself, you are preoccupied with a false self, because it's simply constructed and fleeting. Where did it come from? Most of the selves that we present to other people, we've sort of like mined our consumer preferences and then externalized them. And that's us. That's not enough. It's not enough. So to the extent that you're able to opt out of that preoccupation, to step away from spaces that require it of you, I do think that it's conducive to the kind of spiritual discipline and commitments in life that Jesus is calling his followers to here. So to bring this point to a head, if you were to look at your credit card statement or show each other our screen time, that's like the new trust fall. It's like show each other your screen time, right? Your social media habits, the amount of mental energy you spend thinking about how others perceive you. Are you living like someone who's given up every hope other than Jesus, or as someone who's desperately trying to save their life? The other part of this is that self-expression and self-construction are inevitable aspects of life in our culture. And I know I can hear the Christian, I can hear what I'm supposed to say. What I'm supposed to say is, don't express yourself, just be like Jesus. I know that's what I'm supposed to say. It just feels a little cheap. It feels a little cheap because what does that mean? Is Jesus this like infinite homogenizing force where we all become cookie cutter versions of each other? Whenever that's been tried on a religious level, nobody winds up looking like Jesus. They wind up looking like the person who's in charge, right? The promise of Christianity is that your true self is not to be found in your particular self-expression, but in the particular way that you manifest Christ to the world. Let me say that again. Your true self is not to be found in your particular self-expression. Lose the idea that your personal brand is you. Your true self is to be found in the particular way that you manifest Christ in the world, which only you can do. Only you can do it. The people sitting next to you are going to do it different. But yourself, your true self, will be found in the way that you manifest Christ to the world. That's who you truly are. Your true self is found in laying down your life for the sake of love, in ways that are dramatic and mundane, in ways that are quiet and gentle, and in ways that are sort of explosive. Your truest self is expressed in sacrifice, is what I'm trying to say. Regardless of who you are, your truest self is expressed in sacrifice, which is to say, your own particular, localized, context-specific imitation of Jesus, who laid down his life for you. So let me challenge you with this. Can you point to a specific moment in the last month where you laid down something you wanted, your comfort, your reputation, your preferences, your time, for the sake of love? Because that's where you were your truest self. And if you can't think of anything, then what would it look like to do that? Let me wrap up with this question. Who are you? In the end, you are whoever you give away for Jesus. I'm going to close with a story told by the great Orthodox bishop Anthony Bloom, who was of Russian origin but eventually spent his life ministering in the United Kingdom. And in his fabulous book, Beginning to Pray, he tells this story, and I'm going to read from it. These are his words. It was the years of the Russian Civil War when this is 1918, 1923, when the opposing armies were contending for power, conquering and losing ground over the course of 3 years. A small town fell into the hands of the Red Army, which had been held by the remnants of the imperial troops. A woman found herself there with 2 small children, 4 and 5 years of age, in danger of death because her husband belonged to the opposite camp. She hid in an abandoned house, hoping the time would come when she would be able to escape. One evening, a young woman, Natalie, of her own age, in the early 20s, knocked at the door and asked her whether she was so-and-so. When the mother said she was, the young woman warned her that she had been discovered and would be fetched that very night in order to be shot. The young woman added, "You must escape at once." And the mother looked at the children and said, "How could I?" Natalie, who thus far had been nothing but a physical neighbor, became at that moment the neighbor of the gospel. She said, "You can, because I will stay behind and call myself by your name when they come to fetch you." "But you will be shot," said the mother. "Yes," said Natalie, "but I have no children." And she stayed behind. We can imagine what happened then. We can see the night coming, wrapping in darkness and gloom and cold and damp this cottage. We can see there a woman who was waiting for her death to come. Natalie probably asked herself more than once what would happen to the mother and the children when she was dead, and there was no reply except the word of Christ. No one has greater love than she who lays down her life for her friend. Probably she thought more than once that in 1 minute she could be secure. It was enough to open the door, and the moment she was in the street, she was no longer that woman. She became herself again. It was enough to deny her shared identity. But she died shot. The mother and the children escaped. It should be self-evident that a woman's life is not more valuable because she has children. That's not the point of this story. I'd like to imagine that Natalie would have done it anyway, but it's a war. You've got people in need. She did what she did. If Natalie had opened the door and stepped out into the street, she would have been herself. She would have been telling, "This is who I am." But paradoxically, by staying and waiting to say a false name, to claim a false identity, she expresses her truest self. Because the specifics of who she was were being offered for the sake of love. Not everyone could have passed for that woman. Who Natalie was mattered. But it mattered because only she, uniquely and particularly in that time and place, could manifest Christ's self-sacrificial love for this mother and her children. You live in this time and this place. How many years do you get? 80 if you're lucky? How much of the world do we get to live in? Not that much. We live in this time and this place. You come from where you come from. You are surrounded by the people you're surrounded by. And if you claim Christ, then yourself, your identity, has been given to you indelibly in your creation, made in the image of God, and one with his blood at the cross, which declares you a child of God. That is who you are. You are who Christ has made you to be. And the way that you express that self is by looking like him in ways that are little and big. So you live in this time, in this place. I know, you got to figure out who you are. Just don't stress too much about it. You will find yourself most truly in the discovery of the person who can manifest the love of Jesus in the way that only you can do. You will find yourself most truly in the discovery of the person who can manifest the love of Jesus in the way that only you can do. This is the only true self-expression. Amen.